looks right, throws a deep pass, right side, end zone, it's caught, it's a touchdown. And the Cardinals continue to pour it on.
Welcome to Cardinals Underground.
All right, well, it took us to the end of the offseason, but finally we get to an edition of Cardinals Underground where I do believe that Kyle Odegard is the title sponsor. Is this presented by Kyle Odegard, this edition, Darren Urban? Because we're going to talk about and only talk about offense. So, you know, there's an Owen offense, there's an Owen Odegard, and Kyle is here to go ahead and lead this discussion. It basically is like a breakout session. You know, after a conference, a business conference, they have the breakout sessions.
I'm just going to monologue for an hour.
That's right. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to talk offensive Cardinals for who knows how long. I mean, we'll have to cut Kyle off at some point. But, you know, finally, your podcast is here for you, Kyle Odegard. When I say Cardinals and offense, you know, where would you like to start? Go ahead.
I think it's a high ceiling. We'll see what happens, but yeah, there's going to be a very optimistic tone from this corner of the screen throughout this podcast.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you right there. Are we saying that because just 2 years ago, in 2018, the Cardinals offense, let's face it, guys, was historically bad. Not just bad, it was some of the all-time worst numbers in terms of yards per play, scoring output, third down conversion rate. I mean, they ranked at the bottom of the NFL in almost a half dozen key categories, which had been seen only once before in the common era of the NFL. I mean, and then there was some other ranking, right, Darren, that came out in terms of the last 10 years?
Yeah, somebody did a ranking of the best and the worst of the decade. And the Cardinals, unfortunately, that 2018 offense was the worst of the decade. Fun fact, the third worst offense of the decade was the 2012 Cardinals, and the fifth worst offense of the decade was the 2010 Cardinals. So we've seen a little bit of it, but that 2018 offense was obviously very poor. And to see how much they jumped in a single season was pretty unbelievable. And I'm as bullish as Kyle is in terms of how it can continue to trend forward.
Yeah, post Kurt Warner and then post Carson Palmer. Yeah, those teams struggled with about 7 Gs in there. And look, no QB, no chance, no QB, no production. And in any analysis of this Cardinals offense, you got to start with Kyler Murray, right?
Yeah, I mean, Kyler Murray is where it begins and ends because, I mean, I don't know how good, for instance, that 2018 offense was going to be, but the combination of Sam Bradford and Josh Rosen just wasn't going to get it done. I don't think it was ever going to be great, but I don't know if it would have been as bad with a different quarterback. And I think adding Kyler Murray, yeah, absolutely made a lot of things run. I mean, when you think about where this offense was, even at the beginning of last year, with David Johnson, who was struggling at the time at running back, the receiving situation the way it was, which just wasn't deep enough. And then they were still able to eventually become pretty effective. Obviously, Kenyon Drake helped when he was brought over in the trade, but I think a lot of it was Kyler Murray, and that's where you're going to be, and that's why this is a quarterback-driven league.
I mean, even halftime of the season opener against Detroit, Kliff Kingsbury had the now infamous quote, right, where he's wondering why did he buy that house in PV, which we all learned about, you know, and we realized why he was a little nervous at halftime of the season opener after we saw the house during the draft coverage. But it wasn't just the quarterback who evolved, Kyle. It was the head coach, right? The game planner, the play caller as well.
Yeah, I mean, not only that first game was the first half of that was bad, but really through 4 games, I mean, they were better than they were in 2018. But like we said, the bar was so low that was an easy clearance. But nothing was truly clicking like you had thought that it might after you've heard so much about Kliff Kingsbury and heard so much about Kyler Murray. And then in that Bengals game, I mean, it was close and they won at the end, but they racked up more than 500 yards of total offense. And after that, there were several games where that offense was just very efficient from the first quarter to the fourth. And that was the promising thing. I mean, the point total went up and down. There were more losses than wins, but once you got to week 5, from that point forward, it always felt like the offense had the capability to keep you in the game or win it outright.
And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I don't think we need the numbers to all know. We watched every single play of every single game. Maybe arguably, if you talk to a coach, the two most important categories of any offense, third down conversion rate and then red zone, Darren. And they were two totally different teams between September and December, not only in their production and efficiency, but really in their approach and how they went about, especially in the red zone, attacking a defense.
Well, I don't want to upset the Kyle-centric podcast and talk too much about the red zone because obviously, as you know, Paul, red zone is onto itself on a weekly basis. But I did think that they eventually, found a groove. Again, I think the Kenyon Drake edition obviously made a big difference. I think early last year, the offensive line had to get on the same page as Kliff Kingsbury. I mean, I think you had a bunch of veteran offensive linemen trying to play a system that they weren't used to. And I'm not sure mentally if they were completely – it's not like they weren't trying, don't get me wrong, but I think that takes a little bit of convincing and to get you all the way to where you need to be. And there had to be some give and take. I mean, we all know Kliff Kingsbury kind of adjusted things as they went too. So, some of that was just going to be natural, whether it was Kliff or whoever it was going to be. I mean, you got to have a learning curve. We always go back to Bruce Arians and the first part of 2013. I mean, that was old school NFL football. I mean, there was nothing collegiate about that, and yet it took them half a year as an offense to really figure things out because it was just new. And I think as you went along, you saw this team understand what Kliff Kingsbury was trying to get to, and you saw Kliff Kingsbury understand what personnel he had, and it started to click.
All right, so we've already mentioned O-line, receivers, quarterback, running backs got to mention. Which unit on the offense, Kyle, are you most confident in? Which position group do you think is going to lead the way this year perhaps, or you don't have as many reservations about this group as maybe another?
Well, it may be a position group of one, but I do think it's Kyler Murray. From what we've seen from him, I mean, his rookie season was better than a lot of people thought. I mean, not that many people nationally watch the Cardinals because they weren't a winning team. But I feel like after the season, it was interesting because a lot of people started watching the tape, the all 22 of the Cardinals throughout the season. And analyst after analyst kept on going on Twitter and saying, hey, watch Kyler Murray's plays this season. He did a lot of good things. And we obviously saw it live. And sometimes it didn't translate into victories or statistical production in certain ways, but he had everything. And I just think he's going to be a star.
And
go ahead, Paul.
When Christian Kirk was banged up, he didn't have nearly the weapons that he does now, right, Darren?
Yeah, no, he didn't have the weapons. And I mean, again, we talked about it in previous podcasts. He's trending upward, and he's doing everything that you would expect for a young quarterback who you expect to be a long-term franchise guy. And when you talk about that guy, you should have confidence in him. And that's the best teams. That's where you start on offense is your quarterback and the confidence that you have in them.
I'm not going to argue against Kyler Murray, and the upside is unbelievable. And just the growth he made in year one, and he got 16 starts. It's beyond impressive. And absolutely, you have confidence in that quarterback room for the next decade. But I will say, to counter a lot of the continued criticism from the national media about the O-line, it was refreshing to finally hear a national analyst and a former offensive lineman and Brian Baldinger come out and say, you know what, I've watched the film of the Cardinals O-line. They're not the liability of the offense. And if you're adding Marcus Gilbert back, who you talked to a lot of guys on that team, was the best offensive lineman on the roster at the end of the preseason a year ago before he suffered the season-ending injury going into the Detroit opener. I mean, Kyle, the O-line to me is ready to exceed expectations, especially nationally. And I'm very curious how, if you all believe in the whole continuity and cohesion quotient as well, with those guys playing together for a second year, even though A.Q. Shipley's been replaced by Mason Cole, but he got a lot of reps in December. I am curious about the next step for the O-line.
Yeah, it's interesting because you look at the offense as a whole, and I mentioned Kyler, and I think you like the wide receivers. Kenyon Drake proved to be a very good player. So even though the offensive line came along, I do still feel like that's the group that has the most to prove this season. I think they showed strides toward the end of the season for sure, and the sack total went way down. But you look at it in aggregate, and the pressure was probably more than you would have wanted. And there's a reason why you think that could go down between the continuity and the chemistry between the guys, and the age range is pretty good. A lot of these guys are in their prime, so I can see the step being made, but I also think the group has to prove it, because you don't have a perennial Pro Bowler anchoring that line or anything. I think it's a lot of guys who are solid veterans, but they need to show it again. And then I also worry about injuries at a position where you can get banged up a lot, and that group stayed pretty healthy besides Marcus Gilbert last year. So if you do take in some injuries, how does that affect the offensive line?
So the unit with the most to prove, would you agree with that, Darren? Is it an offensive line? And Kyle's right. There are questions. What's Marcus Gilbert going to be like in 2020? What would he have been like in the regular season? We don't know. Justin Murray made a lot of improvement. Can he possibly compete with Marcus Gilbert? Is Josh Jones going to blow everyone away and exceed expectations, especially minus an offseason? And then Mason Cole. Look, A.Q. Shipley beat him out last year in camp. So what is Mason Cole going to be all about as a starting center again in the NFL?
You know, I can't argue with the offensive line, and I think that's all those questions are reasonable, and you could easily make them be the group with the most to prove. I'm gonna throw the curveball here, and I'm gonna say my answers for both those questions, the unit I have the most confidence in and the unit that I think has the most to prove, is wide receiver. I think on the spot of having the most confidence in, I mean, I think anybody would go to battle with DeAndre Hopkins and Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. And if they stay healthy, even with Kyler, I have a lot of confidence in, don't get me wrong, but he is still growing to a certain extent, where those other three guys, Christian Kirk's still learning, but I don't have any doubts that those guys can succeed at a really high rate. But I also say a wide receiver beyond those three guys, there's all kinds of things that have to be proven. And especially when you're talking about Larry Fitzgerald playing on a year-to-year thing and when he's going to retire, what about those other guys, especially the 2019 draft picks? How are they going to be able to step up? How is losing this offseason going to impact them? And, you know, can they prove? I mean, we're not even to the point with those guys in terms of proving can they be a star in this league. They got to prove they can even be on the roster and be productive in any level. So I think for me, wide receiver can easily fit in both those categories.
Yeah, the coaches don't trust you. They're not going to play you. I think they have a lot to prove to Kliff Kingsbury and the offensive staff, those other receivers that Darren cites. I mean, how would you handicap it, Kyle? If you're talking about Andy Isabella, Hakeem Butler, who missed his rookie season with a hand injury, Trent Sherfield, and I'm missing, and Keyshawn Johnson. You know, I'll even throw my hot take out there. JoJo Ward, the kid out of Hawaii, the Paulie Pigskin breakout player at camp, who's going to come out here and I think is going to do a few things, especially in this offense. How do you handicap everyone else beyond the big three receivers?
What about Chris Streveler as your number 4 receiver, Paul?
Well, you know, as the Taysom Hill type, you know, I don't know if you can just put, you know, WR next to his name. It's just not that easy.
I think Andy Isabella is the heavy favorite to be the number 4 receiver. He's got the highest draft pedigree. He has the speed that nobody else does. Hakeem Butler is the guy that you look at the measurables, and that's an intriguing type player. But from what we saw in camp, he just wasn't ready last season. So he's going to need to make that jump on the field in order to feel comfortable putting him in as that number 4. So I feel like Andy Isabella, if he doesn't grab that number 4 spot, that would be a pretty big surprise to me.
Yeah, as a former second-round pick. How about a player who's going to surprise on offense this year? Darren, are you loaded and ready to go? You got a guy you're watching who you think might surprise?
I'm gonna go with Dan Arnold, just because I think that he was a guy who I think really caught the coach's attention late last year. Now, when I say surprise, I'm not saying that all of a sudden he's going to break out and have 1,000 yards receiving or 10 touchdowns. I don't know if they really have that guy because I think the big players on offense are going to be the ones that we know about. Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, Kenyon Drake. So those are the guys that are going to put up the biggest numbers. But I do think that Dan Arnold, considering where he came from and how a lot of people don't really even know at this point who he is, and we're not going to have an off season where this is the time when we talk about a lot of those guys. That's not going to come up. I do think that he's got a chance to make an impact as a pass catcher. So it'll be interesting to see now. Could be totally wrong. Who knows, the Dylan Cantrell kid who they are moving from wide receiver to tight end and who played for Kliff in college. Maybe he's the guy who ends up stepping up in that role instead. But right now I'm going to go Dan Arnold, and we'll kind of see how that pans out.
Yeah, you flex him out as a tight end. You got a 6'6" guy running down the seam. Yeah, there's a lot to like there, no doubt. Kyle, what do you think? You got a surprise player you keep an eye on in offense?
I wouldn't say surprise, but I think Christian Kirk is going to exceed expectations. I feel like if he didn't get hurt last year, he would have been a 1,000-yard receiver. And now people are wondering, with DeAndre Hopkins coming in, is that going to cut into Christian Kirk's targets, his numbers? I think it's going to be – I could see both of those guys surpassing 1,000 yards this season. I feel like the offense is going to be more efficient, and they are going to run the ball a decent amount if it's going well. But Kliff Kingsbury still likes to pass, and Christian Kirk had the best separation numbers out of anybody on the Cardinals last season. He has the ability to get away from cornerbacks, and DeAndre Hopkins can obviously do that on the other side, but I think Christian Kirk is going to take that leap in year 3, and I think it's not going to be 1 and 1A because DeAndre Hopkins is an all-pro wide receiver, but I think Christian Kirk is going to be a dangerous guy who could even flirt with the Pro Bowl if things go well.
All right, so I mentioned Marcus Gilbert, who I think, has the potential to really be that solid right tackle and be a bookend complement to DJ Humphries. I mentioned my hot take, JoJo Ward, the kid out of Hawaii. What if I threw out there Lamont Gilliard? What if I threw out the 4-year starter at Georgia, rookie last year, lower round pick, spent the year getting stronger, learning the NFL game, has quietly but steadily impressed the coaches like Sean Kugler, the O-line coach. Darren, do you think there's any room for Gilliard to challenge Mason Cole at center? Do you view that as a competition at all?
I'm not going to rule it out just because Mason Cole's experience is relatively limited, although he did start an entire season. So yeah, that's possible. That's absolutely possible. I feel like Cole having that entire year is going to help him in a lot of ways. And even though you don't do a lot of offensive line stuff in the offseason, I think losing this offseason is going to hurt somebody like Lamont Gilliard because you're just not getting those reps and you're not getting the time on the field where Sean Kugler is showing you, do this. I know you're supposed to do this, but you're having this false step or whatever it might be. And I think that's going to hurt a little bit. And I think given how training camp could unfold, where you're going to need a lot of reps for the guys that are going to be playing a lot, I just wonder a little bit about how guys that are not atop the depth chart from the outset are going to be able to make big moves on the depth chart.
Yeah, and that's a valid point because at center, it's not just about your one-on-one blocking in camp and how physical you are and what are your mechanics. You got to be the quarterback of the O-line. You got to make the line calls. Obviously, that year of experience for Mason Cole is critical. Your quarterback has to trust your line calls. That's a big reason why A.Q. Shipley was the guy a year ago, just all his experience. So you're right. It's an uphill battle for a guy like Lamont Gilliard. Speaking of all the calls, how about the play caller himself? How innovative do you expect Kliff Kingsbury to get in year 2, Kyle? We know he's had a lot of time to look at a lot of film, and he said he's even gone to the nether regions of college football and some of the lower levels looking for innovation.
Yeah, I think he found a nice balance by the end of last season. I mean, we saw some tricky stuff from start to finish, and he certainly didn't shy away from it late, but I think he realized how much he has to have those staple plays in there and to really run that sort of stuff a lot in practice so guys are completely familiar with what they're doing on offense. And you're right. I mean, they're all back basically from last year, so everybody's already comfortable, and you can add more wrinkles. So I think the way he dresses things up more so than trick plays, I think he'll continue to do that, where you see the motion, you see the guys moving before the snap and then, resetting. And there's a lot of eye candy even before they snap the ball. I think he's going to have fun with that. But I think he also realizes he may have done too much at times, especially early last year. And he doesn't want to do that, where he's dressing things up so much that he's confusing his players.
I think, and this is a gut feeling, I still think he wants to go up tempo more. I still think he really wants to get a playoff every 15 seconds. I really think he wants to see what happens if they can truly keep a defense honest, keep the same personnel on the field, and just get those first downs, move the sticks, let's go. And a lot of their inability and frustration, I think, for the coach last year was the fact they couldn't get into tempo nearly as much as he wanted. But when they did, it was amazing how often DJ Humphries would tell us in the Big Red Rage that they got touchdowns out of it because the defense, and especially the front seven, those guys were gassed. And I think he's intrigued by trying to do more and more of that this year.
So you're saying, Paul, he really wants to order the code red. We just got to –
yeah.
I want to lead him right where he wants to go.
Yeah, yes. And we'll somebody edited in that movie clip right here. Okay, maybe not. There we go.
I would tend to agree that I do think, again, we don't know how this is going to work out with training camp and the ability to get all this put together. But I do think there is going to be a part of Kliff that wants to get back a little bit more to what he likes the most. I think he did a fantastic job last year of understanding what was going to work and what wasn't going to work and being willing to change that. But he's still a coach, and he's still a coach that has some strong beliefs in some of the things he does. And yeah, I think if he feels like he's got the personnel to run it and the understanding from that personnel, I do think that there's a chance, maybe not all the time, but I do think there's going to be points where he's going to want to kind of upgrade that part of it. Because I think ultimately, for all the good things the offense did last year, I do feel like he feels like he's got a chance to put more points on the board on a more consistent basis, and that's a good way of doing it.
Do you think that he's thinking more and more about 10 personnel? I mean, Kyle, remember this time a year ago, what were we all wondering? A, what is the offense going to look like? B, how often are we going to get 4 and 5 wides? Well, now that he has the receiver room that he's wanted, and the depth exists at receiver, we think, what do you think? If the numbers are there at receiver, will the formations and personnel groups be there more than ever in 2020?
This is probably a bad answer being an analyst of the Cardinals, but I have no clue if he wants to go back. And I think it's one of the big questions in training camp. Like last year, he kind of tried to hide it as much as he could during offseason. But when we got to camp, they were running 10 personnel all the time, and we knew it was coming. But it didn't work very well early on, and they had a lot more success in 11 personnel. So has he switched his mindset completely? Or like Darren said, I mean, you grew up on 10 personnel. You've been mentored by 10 personnel coaches. Like, this is the tree he's from. And is he ready to go back because he's got the firepower? Or does he feel like in the NFL it doesn't work? Because nobody really does it in the NFL at the rate he did it. And 11 personnel is really what teams use. So does he realize that the speed of NFL defenders makes it so he can't run 4 wide, or did he just not have the horses? And to me, I can't wait to see what it looks like.
See, Paul, that's where, I know Kyler Murray came out and said, hey, I don't think not being on the field really hurt that much. I learned as much in the virtual meetings. What hurt who it hurt not having on field work is us. I mean, we could have seen some of these practices. We could have seen how much more if they were doing a lot of 4 wide stuff, or if it was not. I mean, we would have a sense of it at this point had we seen all those OTAs and seen minicamp.
I mean, think of the potential of how wrong we can be now. I mean, we were wrong in so many ways, actually having watched the offseason practices, OTAs, and mini camps. Now, who knows? But you know what? By the end of the season, we saw 13 personnel. We saw 3 tight ends on the field by Seattle. And Kliff Kingsbury mentioned more than once that some of the coaches on that staff, the Tom Clements, the Sean Kugels of the world, they changed his perception. Right, Darren?
Well, it's funny because I just saw something, and I didn't get a chance to read the article yet. I saw it tweeted out, but the point was that a lot of people are making this assumption that a lot of Kenyon Drake's, I think this was Greg Cosell who did the breakdown. A lot of people thought that all of Kenyon Drake's big plays or big games were happening because of the light box and spreading things out, when in reality it wasn't. It was old school type football in a lot of ways. And so again, that's what it's going to be very interesting to see, like Kyle said, how he approaches it now. And I agree with Kyle. I mean, I don't think we really know. I think the up tempo, that's something he can get to and still do not have the 4 wide stuff. That's something I think you can make happen. When you start talking about 4 wide more often, and that fundamentally changes how you're approaching the offense in a lot of ways. And let's face it, whether it was just because of the personnel or whatever it might have been, the success wasn't there when they did it last year most of the time, and they were more successful doing it other ways.
See, I think they're still going to do spread. I mean, obviously they did some 13 personnel, but I think that's a curveball. I can't imagine them using 2 tight ends, 3 tight ends a lot. I still think Kliff Kingsbury is a spread coach, and I subscribe significantly to the lighter box helps the rushing attack, and I think Kliff Kingsbury believes that, where I think the biggest difference might be whether you're running 10 or 11 personnel, he's going to be willing to run the ball more and do that zone read against the lighter box, because I think it did show that it was effective, and we'll see how it goes. And I think the tight ends can be used, but to see more than like 10% of 12 or 13, I doubt that would happen.
Yeah, just because we're talking 10 personnel, I think we're on the same page here, Kyle. It doesn't mean 60 passing attempts a game, right? Because Kliff Kingsbury is the first guy to let you know that when he was the offensive coordinator at A&M with Johnny Manziel, if memory serves, they led the SEC in rushing with him calling the plays. You're talking about a team that for the first time in franchise history, the Cardinals last year, they averaged better than 5 yards a carry. DJ Humphries told the media here recently in the offseason that, hey, our offensive line was top 5 in most metrics when it came to run blocking. I mean, Kyle, you can't ignore that if you're the head coach, game planner, and play caller.
Yeah, and I think he has a good sense of that, because at his core, I think Kliff Kingsbury wants to throw the ball, and if you can throw the ball efficiently, you're going to throw it a lot. I mean, Kansas City is the best example. They're not running the ball because they're so good at throwing. But last year, the Cardinals were, I think, 21st in passing efficiency and 2nd in rushing efficiency. So Kliff Kingsbury learned as the season went on that if I'm this much better at running, I have to do it. And I think that's the strides he made, where he may have forced the pass a little bit earlier in the season, and later he took more of what the defense gave him and what was working. But that being said, at his core, if Kyler Murray takes a leap and DeAndre Hopkins and Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald are who we think they can be, I think he's going to throw a lot.
Yeah, if they are who we thought they are, or thought they were, or thought they will be, then who are the Arizona Cardinals? I'm just going to go full existential right now, Darren. I mean, what is the upside on this Cardinals offense? If they don't end up in the top 10 in most key categories, are you disappointed this year?
Well, see, I didn't think you were going full existential. I thought you were going full Dennis Green. But I think that's a great question. But again, this is when Kyle is saying, there's so much up in the air, not getting a chance to eavesdrop on their virtual meetings and not getting a chance to see them on the field. We don't know that's another part of this that we haven't really talked about, is like, we don't really know what happened when the season ended before COVID hit, and when the players were getting their downtime right after the season and the coaches were all talking about what the season that just happened. We don't know what they decided. We don't know when they looked at the whole thing as a big picture. Okay, we got to throw this out, or we really like this, or we need to do this more often, or if we do this personnel-wise this offseason, we can do it this way, or if we don't know how any of that, all those conversations went, and again, how the roster construction changed anything. I mean, obviously, their offense didn't change a lot, except for adding a 3-time All-Pro wide receiver. So, what does that mean? Did they get DeAndre Hopkins and say, okay, now we got this guy, we got to give him 752 targets this year. I mean, we don't. That's probably not going to happen, but who knows? I mean, maybe they love the idea of DeAndre Hopkins so much that he is going to get a ton of work.
I mean, in the words of Dennis Green, Kyle, who takes a 3-time Pro Bowler like it's, I mean, but even for all the optimism and even the fact we've named this edition of Cardinals Underground after you, you're not crowning them, right? You're not crowning the Arizona Cardinals offense just yet, are you?
Yeah. I mean, why not? What is the unknown about it? It's basically the same group from last year, and then you add DeAndre Hopkins, same coach, same quarterback. So I think it would be a very big disappointment if this offense wasn't top 10, and you start looking at it more than that. I mean, I originally thought about it, and I'm like, okay, they're not at the Chiefs level, and they're not at the Ravens level. Can they be the third best offense? But there's some talented offenses in the NFL. You got the Saints, you got the Bucks, you got the Cowboys. So where can they be realistically? I'm not sure how high they can be, but I think their ceiling is up there. I mean, I mentioned being 7th in efficiency down the stretch last year. If you can build on that and you got Hopkins, I mean, would it surprise you guys if they were top 5 in offensive efficiency this season?
I feel like when Kyle just said that first line about you bring back everybody and you just add DeAndre Hopkins, and how could it not be? And I feel like if you just change the offense to the Cardinals as a whole and throw in Chandler Jones instead of DeAndre Hopkins, that line is straight out of 2016, and that didn't go exactly how you were hoping. So I will be surprised if they don't make a big jump offensively. I will. That doesn't mean it can't happen. I mean, as Kyle said, it would be disappointing if it doesn't, and that's what happened in 2016. It wasn't that they didn't have the talent. It was just disappointing that it never came together. And so I like I said, I will like to see how they do in camp and how much of that, the truncated time together will impact them. But yeah, I'm going to be disappointed if this isn't a really good offense too. Now, again, Baltimore, Kansas City, probably not. Even San Francisco, the 49ers, you don't necessarily think of them like Kansas City, but they scored a ton of points last year. Can they get to that level right away? I think they can. Whether they do or not, we'll see.
Yeah, it was Baltimore leading the league 33 points a game, Niners 30 points a game they averaged, which I think was the second in franchise history, and that's saying something when you consider Joe Montana and Steve Young, and they did it with a quarterback who threw 8 times in a playoff game. So, who knows what you're getting out of Kyle Shanahan and company. By the way, I'll just end it with this. You realize that after Denny Green went on his infamous rant and then he went through that door, he exited the press conference, guess who the radio sideline guy was on the other side of that door getting ready to do a post-game interview, and in his earpiece could still remembers vividly Jim O'Mahony saying, "Oh boy, here comes coach," and he's really pissed. And then all of a sudden the door opened and here comes a huffing and puffing Dennis Green. And let's just say I swallowed hard at that moment.
Okay, 2 quick questions, and I know we're trying to get out of here, Paul, but it reminds me so much of another story that I had about Denny Green and giving me a quote on one day and Bob Baum the next day, who hadn't been there the first day, saying, "We're trying to get you to say the same thing you told Darren." So when Denny got on the radio, were you like, "Hey, could you just repeat everything you just said in there?" I mean,
Yeah.
Well, in the truth be told, I had no idea what he said. I just knew that he had gone off on a rant. But, and someday we'll play this, my last question was just sort of a big picture, man, what's going to stick with you the most, coach? He repeated exactly what he said in the rant, word for word verbatim, except at volume 11, he said it at volume 4. He said the same thing, but in a much more calm, deliberate, and measured manner. It's striking to hear the exact same words.
I got to hear that.
After he had decompressed, it was amazing. It's almost as if he had recited it off a prompter, but he had decompressed, and it was totally different, the manner in which it was delivered. So,
tack it on at the end of the podcast here.
There you go. That'll do it for Cardinals Underground, brought to you by Kyle Odegard.